Deep in the woods, where the trees stretch high enough to swallow the sky, where cell service is a forgotten luxury, and where the silence carries secrets, there are cabins. Some stand abandoned, left to rot, reclaimed by nature. Others still welcome visitors, travelers seeking solitude, families on weekend getaways, hikers looking for shelter. But sometimes these cabins hold something else, something lurking, something waiting. The stories you're about to hear are not just tales. They are real experiences, shared by those who barely made it out. People who set foot inside an ordinary cabin, expecting peace, expecting quiet, and instead, finding something they could never explain. For some, solitude is a gift, a chance to escape the noise of everyday life, to be surrounded by nothing but the wilderness, the sound of wind moving through the trees, the crackle of a fire, the distant call of an owl. That's exactly what Daniel wanted: a break from the world, a solo retreat in an isolated cabin miles away from civilization. No neighbors, no distractions, just him, the woods, and silence. The cabin was small, rustic. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a lantern for light. It sat deep in the mountains, only accessible by a narrow dirt road that took nearly an hour to navigate. By the time he arrived, the sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Daniel felt it immediately. Something was off. He couldn't explain it. Just a feeling. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean in too closely, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. Or maybe it was the carvings. Strange symbols cut into the trunks of trees surrounding the cabin. Old, faded. He ran his fingers over one, feeling the rough edges. Who had carved them? And why? But he pushed the thought away. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, adjusting to the isolation. He unloaded his gear, lit the lantern, and settled in for his first night alone in the woods. At first, everything was peaceful, the kind of quiet he had been craving. But then, just past midnight, he heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps in the distance, slow, measured. Daniel sat up in bed, holding his breath. The steps were coming from just beyond the tree line, heavy, but not rushed. Someone or something was moving out there. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it through the cabin window. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. Maybe an animal, he told himself. Just a deer moving through the brush. He convinced himself to go back to sleep, but deep down, something felt wrong. When he woke up, something was different. Subtle, but wrong. The chair by the fireplace had moved, just slightly. A few inches to the left. He was sure he hadn't touched it. His backpack, which he had left zipped, was now half open, but nothing was missing. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was just still half asleep. But then he stepped outside, revealing a set of bare footprints in the dirt, leading toward the cabin. Not away. Footsteps, they were fresh. Human. Someone had been outside while he was sleeping. And worse, they had stopped just at his door. Whoever it was, they had stood there, touching. That night, the noises returned. Footsteps circling the cabin, a shadow shifting between the trees. But then, at exactly 3 a.m., the tapping began. Soft, rhythmic tapping against the window, steady, deliberate. Daniel lay frozen in bed, too terrified to move. The tapping continued, until he finally worked up the courage to look to the window darkness outside. Then a faint outline of a face just beyond the glass. A figure, standing completely still, watching. The next morning, Daniel had already decided he was leaving. He packed his things in a hurry, every nerve in his body screaming at him to get out. But as he reached for the door handle, he froze. The front door, slightly ajar. He was sure he had locked it. His heart pounded as he pushed it open, scanning the clearing outside. Empty. But then he looked down to the wooden floor, footprints, wet, muddy footprints leading from the door to his bed. Someone had been inside, standing over him while he slept. And on his pillow, something even worse. A small, crumpled note, written in uneven handwriting. You weren't supposed to wake up. Daniel running to his car, breath ragged, door slamming shut. Engine roaring to life, tires spinning on dirt. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He didn't breathe until he was miles away, and to this day he never found out who or what had been in that cabin with him. Was this just the work of a deranged stranger lurking in the woods? Or was there something far worse out there that night? What would you do if you found footprints leading to your bed? A secluded cabin. No neighbors. No phone service. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of a fire. For some, it's the perfect escape. A break from the world. A place to be alone, truly alone. That's what Eric and Lisa wanted. A quiet weekend, just the two of them. A little time away from the noise of their everyday lives. So they booked a cabin. Off-grid, deep in the mountains, isolated, peaceful. The owner was waiting for them when they arrived. An older man, weathered, his face unreadable. He handed them the key. But before they could go inside, he said something strange. "Whatever you do, don't answer the knocking after midnight." The first night passed quietly. At first, the fire burned low, and outside, the wind whistled through the trees. Lisa fell asleep first. Eric sat by the window, listening to the quiet. And then, at exactly 12:03 a.m., 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. Eric's breath catches. He waits. Listens. For a long moment, nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence pressing against the walls. He didn't open the door. And eventually he convinced himself it was nothing. Just the wind. Just his imagination. He went to bed. Morning comes. The sunlight filters through the trees. When they woke up the next morning, everything seemed normal. Until Lisa stepped toward the door and the wooden floor. Just inside the threshold, a single wet footprint. It wasn't there the night before, and the door had never been opened. The second night, they locked the doors, checked the windows, made sure everything was secure. But at 12:03 a.m., Lisa clutched Eric's arm. "It's just someone messing with us," he whispered. But deep down, he wasn't sure. They stayed in bed, listening. The knocking didn't stop this time. It continued, louder, more forceful. And then, after what felt like hours, silence. Then, a whisper. Soft. "Right outside the door, I see you." By the third night, they were ready to leave. But the road was too rough to drive in the dark. They'd have to wait until morning. One last night. One last chance for whatever was outside to come knocking. They didn't speak. They barely breathed. And then, at exactly 12:03 a.m., almost shaking the door. Then, a voice. "Eric, Lisa." Lisa gasps. Covers her mouth. They hadn't told anyone where they were staying. "Let me in." Eric couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, walked toward the door. Lisa grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." But he had to know. He had to see. His hand grips the doorknob, twists it, slowly pulls the door open. A rush of cold air sweeps into the cabin. But outside, nothing. Just darkness. Just trees. Just emptiness. He turns back to Lisa, but she's gone. "Lisa." His voice cracks. The fire flickers violently. He searches the cabin, the bathroom, the kitchen. Nothing. Then outside, through the trees, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Lisa. Barefoot, hair hanging over her face. He runs to her, grabs her shoulders. She barely reacts. Her skin is ice cold. "Then," she speaks, voice hollow. "Empty, it let me go for now." They packed their things and left immediately. They never spoke of it again, and they never ever went back. Who or what was knocking? And more importantly, what would have happened if he had never opened the door? There are places in the wilderness untouched by time, places forgotten or deliberately left behind. And when something is abandoned, the question is never just why, but what still lingers there. Two figures emerge from the trees, hikers. their backpacks heavy, their expressions tense. They weren't supposed to be here. The map showed nothing. No structures, no signs of life. But the cabin is real. And the door, it's open. One of them hesitates. The other, driven by curiosity, steps inside. At first glance, the cabin is empty. Dust clings to every surface. The air is stale, thick with the scent of old wood and decay. But on the table, untouched by time, sits something that shouldn't be there. A journal, leather-bound, the cover warped, stained, as if it had been gripped by trembling hands for far too long. The hikers exchange a glance. Then, cautiously, they open it. The first words scrawled in jagged ink, "If you found this, it's already too late." Day 1, the knocking started after sundown. Thought it was the wind, but it came from the walls, not the door. Day 3, saw movement in the tree line. Black shape, watching, blinking, but there are no eyes. Day 5, it's closer. It whispers now. It knows my name. The hikers glance at each other, suddenly aware of the deepening dusk outside. The forest is growing darker. The silence pressing in. The pages turn faster now. The final entry short, desperate. "Don't look at the window." The hikers exchange another glance, nervous now. And then the first knock. Soft. From somewhere within the walls. Their breathing quickens. The cabin suddenly feels smaller. The air heavier. The journal had warned them. But warnings only matter if you listen. The knocking grows louder, circling the walls, moving impossibly fast. One hiker scrambles to close the journal, as if sealing it might undo something. But then, a sound from outside, something moving in the trees. A shape, tall, unmoving, watching. Then, without warning, a loud bang. The door shutters. A gust of wind blows through the cabin, snuffing out their lantern. In the darkness, something shifts. A whisper slithers through the air. A voice not quite human, not quite real. It's inside. Their flashlight flickers. The journal is now on the floor, open to the final page. The ink fresh. The words written anew, too late. They don't look at the window. They don't turn around. They just run. Branches lash at them as they sprint through the darkened woods. The knocking follows them, impossibly distant, and yet right behind them. They don't stop until they reach their car. Breathless, shaking. The headlights cast long beams into the trees, searching for what shouldn't be there. But the forest is empty. The cabin gone. The next morning they return, or at least they try. Because where the cabin had stood, there is nothing. No walls, no door, no journal. A long pause. Then. And yet, that night, as they lay awake in their rooms, safe in their separate homes, they both heard it. A soft knock from inside the walls. Some stories have explanations, a logical reason, a rational cause, but others, they remain mysteries, forever shadows on the edge of understanding, whispers in the dark, unanswered knocks at the door. 3 stories, 3 encounters, each more unsettling than the last. A stranger in the woods who left a warning that should never have been read. A hiker who returned, but was he ever really the same? And a presence that waited, knocking, calling, watching. What do you think really happened? Which story chilled you the most? Let me know in the comments, but be careful. Some stories have a way of finding those who listen too closely. If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to like and subscribe, or you just might hear a knock at your door tonight.